what I want to talk to you today is about the project more widely and how the Atlas sort of came about, what our goals were, how it sort of evolved over the course of the two and a half year project, and where we're looking to go in the future. So the reason this presentation is called Atlas or Almanac is because we genuinely spent about 3 weeks trying to decide what we were going to call this booklet. It began as the cookbook of digitized newspaper metadata, where there were going to be various recipes for how you could combine different data. For a while, it was the Almanac because it gave lots of helpful information and tidbits like Poor Richard's Almanac. And in the end, we decided to call it the Atlas. And that's because we were trying to map metadata across collections. And so Atlas seemed like a guidebook, something to sort of help people journey through this metadata. So it's maybe not the perfect title. I think it actually caused a little bit of confusion with some of the people who have looked at it so far, but we hope it will be a useful guide. So the first thing I really want to talk about is the OCEANIC Exchanges project. So OCEANIC Exchanges was part of the Digging into Data initiative by the Transatlantic Partnership for the Social Sciences and the Humanities. And it was a 2-year funded project, and it had 3 main areas of research. The first one was to look at reprinting across collections. And by that I mean, as many of you may or may not be aware, lots of newspapers throughout the 18th, 19th, and indeed 20th century would take bits of text, bits of information, and reprint them. And the reason they did this was, on the one hand, practical, because they didn't have a lot of foreign news bureaus, they didn't have a lot of journalists on their staffs at first, so they just had to kind of work together as a loose network. The other reason that this sort of happened is copyright was just not a thing for newspapers well into the 20th century. Newspapers were considered public domain in the sense that once you published it, the information was not a creative work, I guess. It was just knowledge, it was just facts, and you can't copyright facts, so you should be able to republish it as much as you like. Now, this perception of newspapers changed quite rapidly in the 20th century with intellectual property laws, but it did exist for a long time, and there was a sense that reprinting was part of the public good. The difficulty we had was that although we knew this practice existed, not just within language groups or within countries, but across the entire world, it was very, very difficult to track. And digitized newspapers made that much simpler, but we still couldn't do it very easily because almost all collections are segregated by national boundaries because the way that funding, as you all know, works. National libraries are funded for the national interest or to provide for their national audience. I think most people have a wider view of their remit, but the letter of the law, so to speak, of how the funding works is for that. So a lot of these collections are nationally siloed. So the project was basically to look at direct transcriptions, actual letter for letter reprintings across different national collections, and also something called semantic drift. So concepts like suffrage or democracy or revolution or rights, how did those concepts move from place to place? And that's a bit more difficult to track, but we were using some new technologies in order to sort of trace that. The final part of the project is the Ontologies project, and that was the part of the project that I led from Loughborough. Now, the Ontologies project was meant to be a support element to OCEANIC Exchanges. It was meant to provide a couple months' work to make tracing the reprints a little bit easier. So the Ontologies work package had 4 basic goals. The first part was to catalog all the back-end metadata. So to take all the different collections, find out what metadata was being used for every single person, every single issue, every single collection, and basically say that this is a title, this is an author, this is a page number, basically so we knew what metadata was available. Then we were supposed to map all of the different collections together. So although they all had generally similar names, they were not identical. So we had to make sure that a title, like a normalized catalog title, was mapped to all the normalized titles across all the different collections, as opposed to, for example, the title as printed on that particular issue. So that was a like-for-like basis, just making sure we knew that this meant this in these different collections. Then we were going to help assist in normalizing the derived data. So when we had our big spreadsheet of all of our reprintings, we didn't have 17 different title platforms. We could just have one that said title, and it would combine all the different collections. And we were going to create something called an OWL ontology. And the OWL ontology was going to be machine readable, which meant that different cataloging systems, different databases would be able to automatically map across collections. We gave ourselves a very, very ambitious deadline for this particular project of about 3 months. And that was absolutely ludicrous in retrospect. We had been under a false impression that mapping the metadata across collections would be a very simple and straightforward process. We believed that most of the collections used either Dublin Core or Metz Alto or some variant of the big standard metadata formats, and that they would have been populated in very similar ways. And the reason we believed that was because there is a general sense of consistency in library science. There was a general sense of consistency in the commercial providers who were digitizing these texts for various libraries. We were very wrong. And it was not so much a case that there was wild variation. If there had been wild variations between different collections, that would have been easier. We could have just said, well, this doesn't have another match in this other collection. What we actually found were very, very subtle differences between how different metadata fields were being interpreted. So things like basic bibliographic information, like publisher or title or date even, were being interpreted in just very slightly different ways, so that you couldn't necessarily get like-for-like data, but it looked like you could. And we wanted to sort of make sure that that distinction between similar data and identical data was made more clear to other researchers, as well as to librarians who were expanding or improving these collections as they move from project to project and iteration to iteration. So newspapers in particular are difficult things to catalog. And I say that as a newspaper historian. I know for a fact that historians of visual culture and of books and of other things would say that their item is just as difficult and just as idiosyncratic in order to catalog. But I really do believe that newspapers do have their own unique elements to them. Part of that is the various way that newspapers were consumed. So newspapers were created as essentially ephemera. They were created as, if not disposable objects, objects that would be quickly replaced. So they're on a very particular type of paper. They are obviously produced very rapidly in terms of their periodicity, how often they come out. But they're also written in a conversational tone that expects, I suppose, that the readers will have read other things in the collection in a non-linear fashion, as well as earlier editions that they'll be looking forward to later issues. There is an ongoing dynamic and sort of disjointed conversation in a newspaper, and again, between newspapers, because reprinting and commenting between newspapers was so rapid and so frequent. So it's sort of like walking into a room and only hearing a couple of people all having conversations at once. So creating a digital object of a newspaper seems kind of straightforward. You scan the 4 pages, you make the text searchable, but it's really fragmented from the world in which it belonged. The other thing that's really important about newspapers is the editions and the variant materiality of them. I think editions is pretty easy to understand. You have a morning edition and an evening edition, or you have a Scottish edition and a shipboard edition for the cruise ships, as well as the London edition. And that sort of makes sense. And you have to sort of make a decision about what you're going to digitize and what you're not. and how much information you're going to give about that digitization. The other part about editions and materiality, however, is the fact that a lot of 19th century newspapers were run under adverse financial conditions, we'll say, especially in the colonial press. They would run out of ink, run out of good quality paper, run out of ease. I actually have seen issues of certain newspapers where word choice gets very strange because they've clearly run out of one letter because they only had a small typeset available at their printing press, some creative vocabulary in their reprints. And this is really interesting. There are some newspaper editions where the first 40 copies or the first 100 copies are on purple, cheap wrapping paper, and then they get their shipment in and they can print the rest on the good quality. Well, you think, yes, I want to digitize the good quality one, the one that has the clearest image, but they are different versions and they had different readers' experiences attached to them. Bits of text move around during the day as they find typos or they want to take out news stories because new information has arrived. So editions aren't just about the official big edition, but all of these little micro changes that take place that we don't necessarily have all the information about, but we would like to try to get some information about. And finally, newspapers had a significant afterlife. People clipped them, scrapbooked them, stuck them in envelopes in large research libraries. The image you'll see on the bottom of the screen here is actually a critique of a series of essays that appeared in a newspaper. So they've pasted a whole bunch of newspaper articles into a book and then written little commentaries about them for publication. So they have these really interesting afterlives as digital objects, which somehow needs to get connected to the physical and the digital object we are digitizing. So newspapers are weird. They're hard to digitize and they're very hard to give the sort of interesting metadata that a lot of researchers want to get. The other thing that we discovered when we were putting together these catalogs of metadata across these different collections is that things that we thought of as facts, as, whole units that were kind of uncontestable, were not facts in the slightest. It really turned me from a sort of rationalist into an empiricist. Things are not quite as obvious as they first appear. So date and geographical ranges are probably the most important thing. The idea that a newspaper was published on a certain date is not an uncontestable fact because it was assembled over the course of several days. It was probably printed over the course of several days, and that publication date was sort of the street date of when it became available to people. One of the collections we looked at, the London Gazette, was particularly frustrating because all of their editions had two dates on the top, from Tuesday till Friday. All the news was covered from Tuesday till Friday, but it was actually published on Friday, but all the metadata listed the Tuesday date as the date it was actually coming through. So it was a fact, but it wasn't the fact we thought it was going to be, and it was very confusing. The other thing that we really noticed is that users of these collections, and we did interview a lot of different types of users, from family historians to literary scholars to data scientists doing culturenomics to journalists and parliamentarian researchers, they wanted to be able to ask questions that metadata just was not good at facilitating answering. They wanted to ask questions that were very human understandable, but that you couldn't type in keywords that are very good at answering that. And if you've ever just asked Google a question, especially Google 5 years ago, you can kind of understand that it doesn't really understand the semantics of what your question is. And if anyone has not seen this film with Katharine Hepburn, it is a wonderful film about just that thing, about researchers working in a newspaper research library and how they know how to parse questions in a way that the computer can't in order to find the information they need. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible and that the digital world is doomed to never answer our questions as well as librarians can, but I think there is a role for that human element in how we parse and how we ask questions and how we engage with metadata to help us guide our path to those answers, which again is why we thought of it as an atlas. It wasn't about you being able to type something in and get the answer out. It was about giving you an overview of the terrain so you could figure out where you would want to go. So there was a difference between flexible fuzziness, how you document uncertainty, especially for things like the date, the location, and in some cases, political affiliation or type of article. The fact that something was an editorial or an advertisement or a news story is actually way more contentious than people were giving it credit for. So our project, once we decided that it was a giant mess and we had no idea how to solve it, was to come up with some kind of nomenclature or naming conventions for all of these different aspects of the project, and a taxonomy. So a hierarchy of these things. Are these bibliographic details? Are these descriptive of the physical object? Are they about the digital object? Are they metadata about the digitization process? Those kind of big categories. And then how do we name the little metadata underneath? We did try to do this in an organic way. So we did not just come to the project and say, well, I, as a periodical scholar, know exactly what we should call these things, and I'm going to use my vocabulary. That was really tempting, but we didn't do that. We tried to go to the documentation. We tried to essentially crowdsource how these terms were used by librarians, by metadata standards. We got some newspaper indexing handbooks from the Michigan Library from the 1920s that told you exactly what the categories you should use when cataloging newspapers, which was very helpful, which I don't see a lot of people reference, but it seems to have been very influential in how these catalogs were created. And we tried to organically develop things that were the most commonly used terms across different fields of study and different use cases, including just general users. And then we tried to be precise. So I put a couple pages here from the atlas, which is available online, of things like article title or headline. We never could quite get our head around which was the better way to label that. We put different language variants, as well as our technical definition. And that was the most important part for us. Like, even though Emily Bell, who was my main collaborator on the atlas, she was a periodical scholar as well, although she came from an English as opposed to a history background, we would have whole conversations 30 minutes in before we realized that we were using words in slightly different ways, even though we are both academics from similar backgrounds with similar fields of study. We weren't using the words the same way. So we had to learn to be incredibly precise and almost pedantic in how we were documenting these terms. And then to give real world examples, because as much as we believed in our terminology, we wanted people to understand that there is variation in how these terms are used. And if they're using a variant term to mean the same thing, they could see in context, yes, that's the word I mean, or no, I actually mean that one over there. And that way, they could find where they were trying to get to, even if they had a different language or vocabulary choice than we came up with. And there is no right answer to any of these questions. This is all about interpretation, and our goal was to give as much documentation as to how we came to our interpretation and the possible other pathways to that interpretation or to similar interpretations, so people understood that this was fuzzy, and it was okay that it was fuzzy. Fuzziness allowed multiple points of entry. It was a good thing, not just that it was imprecise or somehow not capable of being precise. The next stage was a little bit terrifying. So once you have a nomenclature and once you have a taxonomy, so you have these groups of different terms, we tried to make an ontology. Now, an ontology in information science, computer science, and to an extent in philosophy as well, is about the relationships between terms. So while a taxonomy is often very hierarchical, you have one big main term and then lots of subterms underneath it. An ontology, like linked data, like Wikipedia articles, like the internet more broadly, can be multi-vectored. Things can link up, down, left, right, through the z-axis, all different directions. And we decided that we were going to try to show the relationships in two different ways. So this terrible, terrifying image was actually created by 14 different people, all working at the same time with different collections. And the idea is that the lines between the different boxes, which are all different metadata fields, are the hierarchy within the actual XML or JSON file. So that was the hierarchy the library created. We then created our own hierarchy, which is boxes within boxes, of what we felt were more periodical scholar-based ideas of how these terms are used, as opposed to sort of the practical indexing way that computer scientists assembled it. We created the boxes and then color-coded everything, so we'd have the title box, and then we'd have all the different collections would have their variant of title. This was how we were going to map them like for like. You can see that big blob of blue on the far end. Those are all the Trove social media boxes, and we just kind of gave up at that point because we were having tons of arguments about, does this go here? Does this go there? I think this means that. Wait, this line is going in like rapid circles around our whole diagram. And we decided that this was not going to work to create some kind of holistic ontology. The benefit of this, and I really do think this was an amazingly beneficial project, was we understood finally the degree to which the collections themselves were inconsistently interpreted, not just by people who were using them, because we had one or two people from each language group working on each collection, and they would disagree about what certain terms meant and how they were being filled based on the content, based on examples. But also, if we looked at multiple examples within a particular collection, you could tell that over time, there had been changes in staffing with very slight differences about how data was going to be inputted, or if some data had been drawn from MARC or library records, and some data had been inputted by hand typing, and some had been inputted by the digitizers looking at the label on the reel of microfilm. They had different modes of operation, and so there was inconsistencies about how these fields were filled in. And we learned that because we couldn't agree on what these fields meant when we were trying to do this graph. So that was a really good learning experience for us. And again, I'm very much a big advocate of you do not have to make everything standardized so long as you understand that things are not standardized and how they are not standardized. That fuzziness human beings are perfectly capable of understanding. So that's why we created the Atlas of Digitized Newspapers and Metadata. It exists in two forms. The hard copy form is the report that includes the 13 collections from the National Libraries of Australia, New Zealand, Finland, the Netherlands, the State Library of Berlin, the British Library, Chronicling America, and the University in Mexico, the National University in Mexico. And it is a static report. So it has the language variants of our team members, it has the examples that we could find of these terms, and it has all of the metadata as they existed in roughly 2018 to 2019, depending on when we completed that part of the atlas. The second place the Digitized Newspaper Atlas exists is online. So we do have the website version, which at the moment is largely identical to the hard copy, but because it's available on GitHub, it is very easily updatable. So what we are hoping is we're going to be adding new collections from other national libraries, especially Africa and Asia and South America, which are not represented at the moment, as well as minor updates. So for example, Papers Past at the National Library of New Zealand has just made a direct download of their OCR text available. So we can move that now from available from special permission from the library to available at this download link. It's a minor change, but it keeps it nice and updated. The thing that was really important about the atlas, however, was not just the metadata maps, but it was actually the different newspaper histories that we were able to create from this. So if I just bring that up really fast on here. The database histories that are available on our collections, what they provide is a sort of pocket history of the collection, and here's you guys, as well as the consulted libraries that collection includes. So if it's not just the British Library's collections, but if they had loans from other people. And then a history of the microfilming, the digitization, and the selection processes. And then it goes into more detail about data quality and metadata schemes and user interface. But we, especially I, fought really hard to include this microfilming section in all of our databases. And I thank everyone at the library who filtered information to us to help me fill in these sections. Because it's a filter. It's part of the materiality, it's part of the selection process, and it's part of the final project that I think people forget had an influence when they're just looking at the digitized object. So we try to make like-for-like histories across all of our collections, and that's sort of a requirement going forward. We don't just want to be another Wikipedia list of all the digitized newspapers out there. We want this to give people a real sense that they understand what these collections' histories are, what sort of the archaeology of these collections are, and what they can and cannot ask questions about because of the way the collection was formed or the data that was entered, and hopefully what they can contribute to these collections or to enrich the data behind these collections. So once we had put this report together, there were a couple of things that we really wanted to highlight for people. First of all is the fact, like I said before, that there is a huge amount of value in documentation about how we use language. So we wanted to make sure that we had dictionary type definitions and industry definitions for our different topics, for our different technical headings as well. But we wanted the usage notes, and that was probably the most important part for us and the part that we found most difficult to put together, simply because we wanted to give people a sense not just of what the term or the metadata field meant in the documentation, but how by looking at lots and lots of instances of it, it actually was used. So whether it was pulled from existing library records, which are often incredibly detailed because they've been curated over, several staffing generations, or whether they'd been hand keyed by sort of external crowdsourcing where they just typed in what they saw and didn't really interpret it, or whether there was like strict guidelines on what the categories meant and what you could and couldn't include. We found all of those variations across most of the collections, so depending on the different fields. So we wanted to really make that clear to people that if you look at this metadata field, or if you're searching by this metadata field just on the normal graphic interface, this is the mindset of the person who is entering it. So again, things like news versus advertisement. I have a very good idea of what I consider news and what I consider editorial and what I consider advertisement, but those aren't necessarily the rules that were used in the actual cataloging of those things. Sometimes their rules are really interesting and they give me an insight into the newspaper that I wouldn't have had. So that's also valuable. It's not just about, mapping what I think onto what other people think, but actually opening up different ways of thinking about newspapers. And this project has completely changed how I think about newspapers, actually. The other thing that was really important to me was the dynamic version of the atlas. So we wanted to make the nice hard copy version because it's kind of helpful to have that reference book that you can just plop next to you on your desk and think about while you're doing things and look things up as a reference. But when you work in the digital world, by which I mean digital documentation, you get so much opportunity to really categorize dynamic context. So linking documentation, especially legacy documentation, to different parts of collection is so valuable. Like we found, and I won't mention any names, we found several libraries who, if they didn't hide their legacy documentation, they certainly stopped linking to it. So it was sort of like, well, that was for the old version, so it doesn't matter anymore. And I would have to explain that actually these fields were filled in during that old time, so I need to be able to see the old documentation. And it was never privileged information I couldn't get access to, but it was something that they considered to be, you know, old and not useful and not updated and actually confusing to people if you had the old documentation floating around. Version control was very important for a lot of collections, and I can completely understand that. I see a lot of value in the legacy documentation, especially we spent a lot of time going through the IFLA conference proceedings, looking at PowerPoint presentations on like half-conceived digitization projects and what they were trying to do and where they were going with their projects. And that was so much more useful than just having the final documentation at the end. Categorizing dynamic context in something like GitHub also lets you give the provenance chain for the collection and for the data. So who inputted the data? When did they input it? What was their remit? You can put all this information in layer upon layer in a way that some catalogs don't have the fields or the space for without just putting a giant note. You can actually link this kind of provenance data much more easily. You can also make it clear what are the variants of the physical and the digital objects that exist? Are there multiple resolutions? Is there a microfilm scan as well as a hard copy scan? And this is the thing that came up more than anything else in all of the workshops we've done, is wanting a visual dynamic representation of exclusions from the collection. What is missing? Which issues are missing, and are they missing because they're not digitized? Because they don't exist in physical format anymore, were they lost during the war, for example? Or did they never exist? Did they just not publish an issue on December 12th? Those three questions haunt periodical researchers. So being able to have some kind of indication of that requires manpower. But as I'll try to get to later, you have an army of historians and general scholars and family historians who have kind of documented this information and would love for it to be collated somehow. So that's why I really love the idea of the dynamic growing atlas. The other thing that we really learned about the fuzziness and the imprecision is the value of indexes. I admit I was not a big index person before I started this project. I found them kind of difficult to use. They never had the terminology exactly what I wanted. They'd often have, as one of our workshop participants noted, they'd have a single entry for a particular topic, and then, you know, that was like one sentence in a huge article, and it took you ages to find it, and then it wasn't even relevant. Full text searching was the way to go. Type in what you want, then you get it. What I learned is, especially working with the 19th century, is language changes. Concepts of related terms change. I found this out really significantly when one of my students was attempting to do a project on news reports about mental health and mental health crises, especially around postpartum depression. She simply could not find anything in the newspapers. And then I realized she was typing in 21st century terminology, not just technical terminology, but things like mental health awareness and, you know, postpartum depression and things like that. And I said, no, you've got to type in lunatic, sanitarium, hysteria, things like that. And she says, like, well, those are horrible words. I don't want to type those words in. And I would say, well, yes, but those are the terms that were used. So that was something that, looking at indexes from the period, like the Times index that was compiled, you know, as it was going along in many cases, it gives you a sense of how the ontology, or at least the taxonomy, was thought of when the newspapers were written. And again, it just gives you that extra way in to the collections. And again, things that I thought were not at all related or not relevant in a particular article were important enough to the 19th century indexers to make their own heading. So it tells you about how people read these collections, that they thought that that was an important topic within that article. So metadata, I think, can serve a similar function as indexes. It certainly is trying to serve that function by thinking about having multiple layers of the way things are indexed, as opposed to thinking about the one canonical correct category that something should go into. Having multiple temporal and geographical points of entry is really helpful. Provenance, this was something else that was really common. There was a hierarchy of provenance, authoritative or authorized metadata versus the sort of plebeian crowdsourced metadata. And I always found that quite harsh, because I have been humbled by family historians who are way more knowledgeable about certain aspects of my research than I was before I met them, because it's a passion for that particular area, and they know everything. They might have been researching it for 30, 40 years. So it would be super, full of hubris of myself to think that just because I'm a researcher in an academic institution that I know better, and my metadata or my advisory board advice would be better. And I think the problem with adding metadata that's been crowdsourced, or adding metadata from external sources and kind of importing it in, is giving credit where credit is due. People have done hard work to create it. But also, if you don't put a provenance, if you don't say that this librarian did the hard work and put it in, if you don't say that this research team within the library did this, it implies authority in a way that's probably unintended. So if there's no byline attached to it, if there's no human being mediating that content, it is fact. It is positivistically true. And I don't think anyone's really claiming that, but that's how people deal with it. So I think having a more general sense of who's inputting what data and making that visible is really valuable to how we critically interpret and critically deal with these digitized objects, whether you're a family historian or an academic. Which brings me to round-tripping metadata. So round-tripping metadata is one of those things that with most library groups I've spoken to sounds amazing and also terrifying. And I would be interested to hear what you think about it. First of all, there is a huge amount of labor out there, both potential labor, people who just want to contribute to these projects, as I'm sure you've all experienced with various digital initiatives the British Library has done, the maps in particular. But there's also just a lot of it that's already been done. When I was in the National Library of New Zealand and I was typing in very random keywords into their catalog, I found this document, which was a spiral-bound printout of an Excel document that somebody had donated to the library. I think I was the first person who had ever seen it after the acquisitions curator. And they had gone through every single newspaper in New Zealand and listed when this particular village had been mentioned. They've made an index of their hometown and every newspaper that mentioned it, and where they mentioned it and the context they mentioned it in. And it was amazing. Like, it was this beautiful piece of additional value that could be really useful to somebody, but only existed as a printout of an Excel document in the library and was not cataloged in a way that people would know it was there. It was perfectly well cataloged. It just, I wouldn't have thought to find it if I hadn't been typing in random keywords. Round-tripping metadata also provides a lot of points of entry. Like I said before, people are very, very passionate about their particular thing they're interested in. So they have really detailed metadata about a specific thing as opposed to a general audience in mind. So it gives people a way of having that discipline or that industry-focused language to get into those sources because somebody's made a different pathway. They're not having to use the general use keywords. And I think it really does promote a lot of community building. I think people in Finland and Australia and New Zealand in particular impressed this upon me, that they felt that they were part of a community, that they were part of the national community because they were contributing to this really important organization. But it was also really important for minority language groups and minority ethnic groups to a lesser extent, that their culture, that they were playing a part in their culture being shared more widely. So in New Zealand in particular, the use of dialectical marks over the OCR was very difficult. But there were people who were involved in making that more OCR readable, making that more machine readable in general, and they were contributing bits of their knowledge, their community, and making it more accessible. So it was really kind of lovely to see that. And it did provide a lot of esteem for people, self-esteem, through that kind of knowledge that they were doing these projects. There is, of course, the fear of the tyranny of the mob. Whose voices do you allow to crowdsource? What fields do you allow them to put data into? How fuzzy are their keywords allowed to be? I mean, at some point, the keyword is not helpful. There have been studies on unauthorized or crowdsourced ontologies, and, you know, sometimes people come up with some pretty unhelpful ones, and they die. Natural deaths, nobody uses them. I was describing this idea of letting everybody just crowdsource their own ontologies and layer them on top of that, but it was brought to my attention that if you have certain groups who are espousing things that are not socially acceptable, especially in the 21st century, it kind of brings Godwin's law into it, which is the longer a discussion on the internet goes, the more likely somebody's going to get called a Nazi. It's just one of those things. There is the sense that there will be edit wars, like you can see on Wikipedia, or there will be people concerned that very culturally insensitive or offensive things will get into the metadata, and there's just not enough staff time to moderate it. And even if you did have staff time to moderate it, why is a person or a group of people qualified to moderate all ways of knowing? You know, what things are offensive versus what things are just different ways of looking at it. It becomes very, very difficult. So my sense from the way the collections currently exist is there are opportunities for layering the archive that are less contentious. So how language like lunacy versus mental health changes over time. There are things like the historical thesaurus that might be integrated to allow that kind of use. Multiple communities of practice, so periodical studies including genealogists, including culturenomics, people who are doing media history, and giving a more general sense of citing all provenance. So you have a sense of who is providing this information, and people are very good at curating their own sources of information. They have a sense that if someone's giving you bad information again and again, if it's linked to a particular person, people will stop trusting them and they will stop using their citations or their ontologies, and they will fade from the general discourse. So I think generally just citing all provenance, whether they're librarians, external contributors, or the general public, and allowing for some kind of layering of cultural, regional, and temporal language would make the archive metadata richer without opening it up too much to scary kind of graffiti in the metadata archives. So I will conclude with this thought. We've created our atlas of digitized newspapers, but what I would really like to do going forward is to create an almanac of digitized newspapers, which is giving guidance and advice about the future, what to look out for, and what paths we might take to have a more profitable or a more engaging set of digital collections across the world. Thank you very much.